The remote clicked and the living room went quiet the way a room goes dark when someone flips the breaker, abrupt, small, final. The television's glow died, the white noise of a soap opera stopped mid-sentence, and for a single instant the house sounded too big for the three of us in it. Then a voice filled the space, sharp, careless, practiced into a kind of authority that needed no argument. "Back to your room," he said. There was no softness to it, no question. My daughter looked down at her hands on the couch as if she had been holding a bowl of something fragile and now watched it slip. The man in the beige blazer, his belt clicking against the chair as though it were a conductor's baton, leaned back and folded his arms like a judge passing sentence. I stood up. I took my keys from the small brass dish on the side table where I had always kept them, where the keys had made a faint sound like a tiny wind chime whenever I moved the remote. I walked down the hall. I opened the door to my bedroom, stepped inside, closed it like setting a period at the end of a sentence, and I said nothing. Saying nothing was not the same as having nothing to say. Saying nothing was a choice. It was the same decision I had made 1,000 times in my life when the situation required patience and records rather than pitch. The deed to the house was in a leather pouch at the bottom of my bureau drawer. The pouch smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. My hands knew where it was before my mind finished the thought. I laid the deed on my bed, smoothed the creases with the back of my hand, and for a moment I let myself remember how that paper had felt when I first signed my name to it. Heavy, then liberating, like a promise kept between two people and a county clerk. I am a widow. I have been married, and I have been alone. I am a black woman who lived a long life alongside the man I married. His picture sits on the mantel with a sliver of light catching the gold of his watch. He always said that being trusted with a signature is a kind of blessing, like being handed the keys to a stage and told you may go on. I took that seriously. For 35 years, I worked at the county recorder's office. I watched hands write names. I watched people sign away pieces of their lives and sometimes get them back. That job teaches you the slow arithmetic of ownership, signatures, dates, notaries, margins filled with tiny official stamps. You learn how paper can order a life. Tonight, paper would be my answer. I did not shout, I did not beg, I did not make a scene. I put the leather pouch and the keys into my handbag, smoothed my hair in the mirror, a soft twist at the nape, just enough to tuck stray gray into a tidy coil, and I walked out of my own front door as if I had somewhere to be. The house smelled of peach cobbler, a remnant of the afternoon when I had warmed the last piece for my granddaughter's visit. A stack of beige mail sat on the hall table. The green velvet armchair where I had fallen asleep watching late movies was empty, the cushion still holding the imprint of my weight like a map of habit. I checked my phone in the car and called the one person whose voice steadied me like a draft line on a tide, Andrew V. Sterling. He'd been a colleague in the old days when he ran a title department, and we argued over whether a comma could alter intent. He had once written to me after his mother passed, just to say that a clean title feels like a consolation. I left a short message. He called back within the hour. "Celeste," he said, no pretense, just the plain recognition of a life we had both cataloged in records and small mercies. "Where are you?" "In a hotel," I said, "near the station. I've got the deed." There was a pause on his end while someone shuffled through papers. "Do you want me to look at it?" "I do," I said, "and Roman will service the notice." Roman P. Cruz was a young man with steady hands and a slow laugh that didn't try to fill space. He had worked as an assistant for Andrew for a year and had done the kind of work that required good shoes and the ability to knock without drama, delivering notices, confirming addresses, standing at thresholds. I had met him once when Andrew brought a file to our kitchen table, a polite, careful man who stood politely by the doorway while the adults talked and then, when it was done, left with the same politeness. I liked the way his eyes looked at paper. They never fell into assumptions about people. "Good," Andrew said. 30 days. We do this by the book." I could have listened to him for hours, but there are moments when patience and speed have to marry. I asked Andrew to draft the notice that evening and to have Roman serve it the next morning. I asked him to check the chain of title and to verify any recorded liens. He said yes, of course, and then asked the question no one wants to hear and everyone needs to account for in the adult arithmetic of households. "Do you want me to look at the accounts, or do you want to handle banking yourself?" I had learned at the county recorder's desk and at my own kitchen table that ownership and access are different things. You can let someone use a house as if it's theirs, hand them a remote, let them adjust the thermostat, feed them pie, but without the deed in their name, none of that is their ownership. I remembered the first time I cashed a Social Security check after my husband died, the row of stamps and signatures and the timid clerk who asked for my ID as if I might be the one to vanish into paperwork. I had kept the deed because through all the years of caregiving and tolerance and borrowing and lending, the paper had been a quiet truth. This belonged to me. I took the hotel room like a small command post. The curtains were a heavy oatmeal. The bed had been smoothed by someone who did not know my rhythm. I ordered room service, a pot of tea, and a small dish of something that tried to be peach cobbler, but was in fact a competent approximation. The aroma brought a lump to my throat, and then a smile. It's odd how comfort comes back through a smell. Sweet fruit, a hint of cinnamon, the way a house remembers recipes long after the faces that made them are gone. I called my daughter briefly. Lena sounded tired. She spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had agreed to believe a story because it was easier than disputing it. I did not yammer. I told her I was staying at a hotel for the night. I did not tell her about the deed. I did not tell her about the calls. I said nothing that might escalate or be replayed. Silence, I thought, like the unlit television, can contain its own kind of volume. Before I left, I had taken a small ritual from the habits of my life. In the drawer where the deed lay, beneath a stack of crossword puzzles and an old library card, there was a photograph of Derek and Lena and me on a summer afternoon, the sun making a thin halo at the edges of their heads. My skin in the photo caught light differently, dark brown with a softness at the rim where the camera washed us into a shared brightness. I am not one to let identity sit as an argument. I mention my skin only because people keep wanting a reason or a label for why I move the way I do in a room. My being black is one strand in a braid of things. It is present in the photograph, in the laugh lines at the corner of my eyes, in the way my mother taught me to stand up straight when someone took a chair that belonged to you. But it is not the whole sentence of my life. When Roman arrived the next morning, he knocked like a librarian who had something important to tell and not to shout about. He carried a folder that made a quiet, serious sound when he set it on my hotel nightstand. He looked at me and then at the paper and then at me again, as if to confirm that he was seeing what he thought he saw, a woman who had the paperwork and a woman who would use it. "You sure you're doing this?" he asked, not unkindly. "I am," I said. My voice was steady. I was not inexperienced in the choreography of official moves. I had watched signatures land and seen marriages recorded, mortgages released, liens satisfied. The world can look like a muddle until you start to follow the line of ink. There are choices in how you show up to this sort of work. You can dress for war, loud and armored, or you can dress like yourself and let the paper do the pointing. I chose the latter, with a small accent of armor. dark trousers, a soft blouse, and the beige blazer I had bought the week before on the recommendation of a woman in a fitting room who had said, "You need a piece that says you are moved but calm." The blazer had pockets deep enough for my keys and the little leather pouch. I told myself it was a uniform of authority, the sort you wear when you plan to be steady. Before the service, Andrew called to confirm the language in the notice. Names correct, dates accurate, the clause that gave them 30 days to vacate. He was precise in a way that has always comforted me. He treats paper like a patient animal that will obey if you feed it the right words. He told me not to engage emotionally in the moment of service. Let Roman do the talking, he said. You keep to facts. There is an old humor in the recorder's office about the fact that paper likes witnesses. We prefer signatures to shouting because ink does not forget. So we arranged for 2 neighbors to be nearby, silent witnesses, not the kind who would make a spectacle, but the kind who would later be asked if the notice had been delivered. Betty and Zoe live on my block. Olga lives 2 doors down. They are women who keep jars of lemon balm on their kitchen windowsills and know everyone's favorite PTA pie. They showed up like a small judiciary of ordinary citizens, each carrying a thermos of coffee and enough plain courage to be present. Roman walked to the front door the way someone carries an important tray, balanced, careful, aware of the weight of what he was about to set down. Derek answered in a shirt that looked like it had been hung on a chair for 3 evenings. He blinked at the sight of the notice as if it were a small animal he had mistaken for a hat. Roman read the words aloud, simple, unadorned, legalese tempered by human nouns. The owner, the occupant, the address, the date. The sentence landed in the house the way rain does on tin roof, steady, unavoidable. Derek's face shifted like someone checking the weather and finding a storm. He laughed. It was an attempt to make light of something that had a legal edge, to blunt the blade with ridicule. "You trying to evict us?" he said, and the words were full of theatricality, as if the concept were a joke he could tell well. Roman did not rise to the bait. He placed a copy of the notice in Derek's hand, set the other copy in a folder, and made a small notation on his pad. He left with a nod. The neighbors gave me small, useful smiles, and then drifted away to their lives of laundry and church meetings and the ordinary responsibilities that outlast theater. After Roman left, Lena walked into my hotel room. She had been out searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps a reason to believe that this was all a misunderstanding. She set down a paper bag from the supermarket at my feet and sat on the edge of the bed where the deed lay. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was small in a way I had not heard since she was a child and had lost a tooth. "Did he?" I asked. "When did he plan to give you the documents?" She looked at the floor. "I don't know." For a long time our family had been fluent in a different language of protection. We had learned to wrap things in kindness and call it family. I had wrapped and wrapped until the bandages had become part of the furniture. A part of me had thought that loyalty and love could prevent the bureaucratic coldness of the world. The truth is more particular. Love is generous, but it does not change paperwork. Lena reached for the deed on the bed with a finger like a child who wants to test whether a blanket is still warm. She did not try to take it. She only studied the ink and the old stamps, the careful cap of my signature. "Is this yours?" she asked, the smallness of the question like a hinge. "It is," I said. "It has always been mine." Her eyes flicked to the photograph on the nightstand where my husband smiled from a summer long ago. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "I thought if we put him in charge of the bills—" "You thought," I said, and there was no accusation in it. I had been where she was, confusing caretaking with surrender, thinking if I assigned a task to someone, they would take responsibility. You thought handing over a bill book was the same thing as handing over ownership. She lowered her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was both an apology and a beginning. We did not finish the sentence about responsibility. Instead, we made plans that night, calls to banks to check account signatories, a list of where spare keys might be, and a reminder to remove Lena's supplemental card from accounts that were linked to my name. I told her that I would not humiliate her. That old maternal instinct was still there. I wanted to teach without shaming. She needed to learn to pay rent to a woman who would accept it, not to be treated as someone who was insulated by someone else's bad choices. There was a small, tender moment when Lena opened the wardrobe and pulled out the green velvet armchair's small care tag. "You still have the tag," she said, half laughing, half mournful. "Some things like to be catalogued," I said. "Besides, you never know when you'll need to show someone why something belongs to you." We mapped out the next steps in the steady, methodical way former clerks do: who to call, what documents to gather, where the spare copies were stored. I asked Lena to pack a small bag with things she would need if she decided to go. She blinked at me, surprised by my phrasing, as if I had offered her a key and she had not known to take it. When I returned to the house in the afternoon to check the locks and to see that they had not made any sudden rearrangements, it felt like returning to a room you know intimately and find a pillow in a different place. Nothing harmed, but a boundary crossed nonetheless. I moved through the rooms with the small gestures of reclamation, opening windows to let the air refresh, setting the kettle to warm with the old familiarity of routine. The peach walls in the dining room caught the light differently in the late sun, and I could almost smell the memory of baking. I spent the evening drafting a short list of items we would need for inventory if that step ever came. Photographs, heirlooms, documents. This was not vindictiveness, it was housekeeping for dignity. It is a small thing to give your life back the contours of how you want it to be kept. That night in the hotel, I sat in a chair by the window where I could see the glow of other rooms. I made a note in my small notebook, a habit I cultivated from years of filing complaints and recording deeds. On the top line, I wrote simply, keys, deed, contacts, witnesses, inventory. Underneath, I drew a tiny sketch of the living room and annotated the positions of the television, the armchair, the side table where the remote used to live. The remote's click was still vivid in my ear. I could recall exactly where the sound had faded. I thought about volume in a different way. Control isn't always about the loudest voice. Sometimes it's about where the switch is kept and who is allowed to touch it. The work did not feel heroic. It felt administrative, sober, necessary. The quiet, methodical steps of paperwork have their own drama. You do not need to shout in order to be heard when you have the right documents. You need only to make sure the documents are where they belong. Before I fell asleep, I called Andrew just to say thank you and to ask one more small favor, that he and Roman be ready the next morning should anything unexpected happen. He promised. I heard the familiar rustle of his files through the line and smiled. The world still had people who loved the order of ink and stamp. It has always been a comfort to me. The next day found me at the bank, not to make demands, but to learn where the accounts were fragile. The banking clerk, a young woman with a name tag that read Jenna, consulted a screen and then leaned over as if she were about to share a small patient secret. "We can put a flag on the account so no one can open new credit," she said carefully. I nodded. I did not want a lecture. I wanted the facts and the means to act on them. "I'll need your ID," she said, and the moment of identification was its own modest ceremony. My driver's license and a photograph, my signature inked the same as the deed, placed me in a small constellation of authorities. Jenna asked if I would like to set alerts. I said yes. Alerts are the new witnesses. When Derek realized banks could be flagged, he tried the usual theatrics of someone scrambling to preserve props. He called my daughter, he texted, he knocked on neighbors' doors seeking sympathies. Sympathies are currency in a house without a deed. They can buy deferred decisions and a little more time. But time, as I had learned at the recorder's desk, is often the very thing that allows paperwork to do its work. I spent the days between the service and the legal meeting in a curious sort of limbo. I would attend to small chores around the house, making sure paint did not peel, that the kettle whistled on cue, that the green armchair did not look abandoned. I would walk the block and see Betty hanging her shirts on the line, Zoe planting something brave in the community bed, Olga sweeping her porch and nodding as if to say the world would continue to be kept in order. At night, when the house quieted, I would sit in the armchair and take a small pleasure in turning the volume on the radio to a level I preferred. It is astonishing how much of life is measured by the degrees of sound we permit in our rooms, the music we play, the words we accept. Control is often as simple as the hand that rests on the dial. Yet, even as I took these small restorations for myself, a deeper work was beginning, an inventory of trust. I called 2 women from the block, Betty and Olga, and asked if they would help me plan a small gathering at the community center about wills and digital passwords. "Bring your neighbor," I told them. "Bring a pen." They laughed, and then their laughter settled into something practical and useful. We agreed on a date. We would teach one another what we had learned the hard way. I slept that night, not triumphant, but ready. The deed was in its place. Roman had done his part with the quiet professionalism of someone who knows how to stand at thresholds and not spill drama. Andrew had the file where it needed to be. Lena had agreed, awkwardly and imperfectly, to begin paying me rent if that is what she needed to prove she could stand on her own 2 feet. In the morning there was a message from Roman. He had left a firm note in my folder. Notice served, signature recorded, neighbor witnesses present. He had added a line that made me smile under my breath. She was polite, he wrote of Derek. Roman's handwriting is neat the way someone who respects official acts writes, small, precise, unadorned. I sat with that for a while. Politeness is not an answer to harm, but it is a tool for moving forward without creating the spectacle that makes people choose sides. I thought about the slow work ahead, inventories, possible disputes, the paperwork that might take weeks to feel finished. I thought about the small, practical details of daily life, where the spare key was kept, who had the password to the streaming service, the name of the cable account on a slip of paper in a kitchen drawer. The house had been full of 1,000 small shared things. Shared things can be charitable, or they can be a way to obscure who holds the legal line. I had always preferred clarity. Papers know what they are. They make less noise than human grief. As I closed the folder that evening and slid the deed back into its leather pouch, I allowed myself a small indulgence, a piece of peach cobbler warmed in the oven, a cup of tea, the radio playing a song that had no claim on me, but that felt like company. I sat in my green armchair and let the room return to itself, the kettle's little hiss rising and falling like a metronome. I thought about the moment when you decide to stop providing sound for someone else's performance and to sit to your own music instead. It is not dramatic. It is decisive. I lay the keys on the table and let them rattle once, a soft metallic laugh. They were the same keys, they would always be the same keys, but how they were used had changed. The deed was not a weapon, it was an anchor, a fact among facts. The quiet had shifted from being a sign of surrender to being a reserve of strength. The night before the meeting with Andrew, I wrote a note to myself. In block letters, in the careful hand of someone who has cataloged deeds and deaths, I wrote, "Steady. Follow the paper. Remember to breathe. Do not make it personal. Keep Lena safe." The bell for my phone rang a dozen small times that evening. Neighbors offering support, Jenna, the bank officer, leaving a tip about how to set up notifications, the hotel doorman checking in because he had always liked the way I folded my scarf. I answered some calls, ignored others, and when the room grew quiet, I took the green armchair and the familiar cushion and settled in. I knew the next day would bring the kind of scrutiny that is best handled by someone who had the patience to read a contract twice. I had not yet reached the meeting that would test the paper's authority in a room with a man who wanted more than he had been given. That moment would come. For now there was the steady cadence of preparation. Calls returned, documents copy-paid, neighbors briefed. The remote sat on the side table like a relic waiting for a hand to claim it. I did not reach for it. I would wait, not because silence was weakness, but because it was strategy. If this story matters to you, if you have felt small in a house you helped make, or if you've ever watched a room go quiet and wondered where your voice was, stay with me. I will tell you what happened next. The morning of the meeting came with a sky the color of dishwater, flat and steady, the kind of light that makes paper look honest. I put on the beige blazer again, partly because it had become a talisman and partly because it had pockets wide enough for a pen, a spare copy of the notice, and my keys. Andrew's office was a city block of polished wood and the soft, reassuring smell of legal paper. It smelled like the recorder's office had when I first started: ink, coffee someone forgot to finish, and the slow, dependable creak of a chair that had seen more signatures than arguments. We sat at a table that had the right amount of distance between us and the door. Andrew slid a folder across toward me with a small, private weight. Roman stood by the window. He looked calm in the way of people who have watched the ritual of notices and responses and know not to confuse drama for authority. The file had copies of the notice, the chain of title, and a list of recorded encumbrances. There were also the bank printouts Andrew had asked Mina to provide that afternoon, redacted in places, but enough to show discrepancies that could not be explained away by casual forgetfulness. "Do you want to speak first?" Andrew asked, his voice the kind that settles the air so you can think. I thought about the living room, about the way the television light had gone out so suddenly that night. I thought about Derek's hand, his belt clicking against a chair like a metronome, and of Lena looking down at her hands. I thought of my husband's photograph on the mantel and the small, steady fact of my signature at the bottom of the deed. I placed my hand on the folder without dramatizing it. "I'll let the papers do the talking," I said. They did. Andrew pointed to the chain of title and to the recorded deed that bore my name in the careful hand of the clerk who had filed it decades before. He explained what the notice did and did not do, that it put a formal mark in place and asked for a vacator within 30 days, that it began a process rather than ending one, that there were ways to respond and options on both sides. He did not make promises. He interpreted facts and offered possibilities, and he did it in the clear, patient tone of a man who had once argued commas with me and knew how fragile certainty can be. Derek burst in like a storm, with sleeves rolled and steam in his voice. He brought with him a kind of indignation practiced to look like righteous hurt. He pointed, he propped his chin, he made a theater out of anger as if fury could conjure ownership. He spoke quickly, the way people do when they want the room to side with their volume. "You can't just kick us out. This was my plan to fix everything," he said. "I've been the one handling the bills." "You've been handling them as a contractor," Andrew interrupted, in a voice that had the patience of the law. "Handling is not ownership. The record shows Miss Everson as the owner. The notice was served in accordance with statutes and procedure." He did not lecture. He showed. He set a copy of the deed between them like a placard and tapped the recorded stamps with a finger. Derek produced a stack of papers that looked at first glance like attempts to legitimacy, part payments, notes on a calendar, a couple of stamped receipts. He wanted them to rearrange the room. He wanted to change the fact of paper with the motion of his hand. Lena sat with her head down, the kind of small human posture that says someone is listening for a truth they had not expected to hear. Andrew opened one of the files and slid forward a document that made Lena inhale. A ledger that showed overdrafts, several late fees tied to accounts Derek had managed, and a small line item note about a loan that had been taken out in the period after my husband fell ill. Derek tried to explain it away as entrepreneurship, as an effort to keep the household afloat. His voice crackled on the explanation like a radio trying to find a station. Lena's face, already torn between loyalty and clarity, went pale. The room had the hush that files bring, facts moving the air in a way anger never could. It is an odd and necessary thing to see a daughter look at the ledger of a household and suddenly perceive the architecture of it. The bills and their due dates were not moral judgments, they were arithmetic. Lena realized painfully and without drama that someone had been spending against accounts she believed were shared and that no one had told her the contours of what was owed. There was no villainy in the ledger, only neglect, carelessness, and a kind of selfishness that had masqueraded as competence. At one point, Derek leaned in so close that the scent of his cologne brushed the edge of the table. He said the words adverse possession in a tone meant to startle, meant to make the legal air seem mutable. Legal terms can be like spells if you say them with enough confidence, but Andrew was steady. He explained that adverse possession is a specific doctrine with strict requirements and that the facts in the record did not reflect those conditions. He did not tell them they had no recourse. He told them what the record showed, what options could be considered, and what likely steps would follow if no voluntary resolution happened. He spoke slowly, because slow words are the ones that make the best paper trails. The meeting ended with an accord that was less dramatic than the storm that had accompanied Derek's entrance. The notice stood. The 30 days stood. Andrew's recommendation was firm. No theatrics, follow procedure, document everything. He told Lena that if she needed to separate finances, start by unlinking cards and reviewing account permissions. Jenna, the bank consultant, had already offered to make an appointment to go through the accounts with her. He suggested mediation if they wanted it, or a plan for staged vacatur if that allowed everyone to maintain dignity. He did not celebrate my victory. There was no gloating in that room. There was only the clear exchange of facts for options. Afterward, Lena and I walked through a small park near the courthouse. The trees were sketched with the tentative green of spring. She spoke haltingly at first, then as if cleaning something long cluttered. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I thought if he took care of the bills, I'd be helping. I didn't ask for the deed. I didn't think—" Her voice trailed off. This was not an apology I needed to demand. It came like light through a window. "I know," I said. "You were helping. You were doing the work you were asked to do. That is something to honor, not to shame. I could hear my mother in the way I softened my words, in the same breath that keeps lessons soft enough to be taken. What matters now is what you do next. Over the following days, I watched a small scene of ordinary enforcement unfold, the kind of choreography that is less cinematic and more mechanical. Phone calls placed, utilities flagged, cards deactivated, passwords changed. Jenna helped Lena at the bank, patiently explaining how to set account alerts and what it meant to have a card removed as an authorized user. There was no lecture about culpability, only instruction about separation and protection. Lena sat with a pen in her hand and listened like someone taking a new course. In the evenings, I took myself to small, steady appointments that felt like chores for the soul. I went to a salon to get my hair brushed and shaped the way I had learned to do in years that felt younger. The stylist, a woman named Tasha, listened while she worked and offered, without prying, a cup of jasmine tea. "You look like someone who has plans," she said, tucking a curl behind my ear. I smiled. The beige blazer had become a kind of armor. The salon was a place to unzip it for a little while. There was also a shopping trip that felt less like retail indulgence and more like selecting the uniform of a woman who intended to keep her life orderly. I bought a pair of dark trousers, sturdy fabric that did not wrinkle, and a new blouse the color of pale slate, something that read as sober but not severe. The saleswoman, Jenna from the bank who moonlighted weekends at the store, folded the blouse with a kind of reverence I suppose some people reserve for anniversaries. "It fits you," she said simply. Clothing, I have always believed, is a way to speak without shouting. During that time, neighbors called with small practical gifts, a potted herb from Betty, a lemon tart from Zoe, a knitted throw from Olga. These are the gestures that mean quietly that someone remembers you are part of a community. I set each gift on the dining room table and looked at them the way you check a houseplant to see if it needs watering, small acts of care that grow into tending a life. Roman was a quiet presence throughout. Sometimes he left me notes in an envelope, very official, very tidy, summarizing what had been done that day. Other times he came to the stoop and stood for a moment and told a small story about his mother who kept her own deed under a book called Recipes. He had a way of making paperwork feel human by reminding you that every file stands for someone's bed, someone's kitchen, someone's history. When movers started calling to offer quotes, nothing dramatic, just experienced men with padded dollies and knowledge of how to wrap a lamp, Roman coordinated so there would be no surprises. The 30 days shortened and lengthened in perception. For Derek, they were a countdown he bellowed about at neighbors as if more noise could create more time. For Lena, they were a caution she used to study what it meant to be financially independent. For me, they were a calendar with small squares waiting for the routine of inventory and the day when the house would be returned to me in law and in fact. I did not stand in the doorway on moving day. I could have. Some people find closure in the precise moment of re-entry, but I had learned that letting the process unfold allowed it to be less dramatic and more effective. Instead, I took the day for myself and went to a small spa uptown where the massage table was a kind of secular altar. There is a strange and necessary holiness to letting something else carry your aches for a few hours. The therapist softened a muscle I had used to clench in reaction, and I felt the residue of those tight days loosen like old knots. Roman texted me updates from the field. There were pictures of boxes, of a couch being wrapped in plastic, of Derek sitting on the porch with a small bag like someone who had been condensed to essentials. He was not theatrical that day. The shout had ebbed into a resigned silence. Lena, meanwhile, moved boxes into the back of a truck with a steadier rhythm than I expected. There, in the physical act of choosing what to take, she was beginning to practice autonomy. When the last box left, Roman and a small team performed an inventory as agreed. Photographs where they belonged, heirloom dishes checked against a list, the green armchair noted as present and apparently undisturbed by the departure. They made notes about the state of the house, nothing malicious, nothing dramatic, merely items to record should any questions be raised later. The movers closed the back of the truck, and a quiet finality visited the curb like evening settling in. I returned that afternoon with cleaning gloves and a box of paint samples. The house seemed smaller in one sense, the echo of fewer voices, but larger in another, because the air could move without negotiating its route through someone else's habits. Windows were opened, curtains washed, and the green armchair, that familiar hill of velvet, was given a place of honor by the hearth. I brewed a pot of tea the way one takes an inventory of comfort, a cedar kettle on the stove, the hiss of steam as faithful as a metronome. The peach-scented memory of the cobbler that had lingered the week before felt now like a breadcrumb trail back to self. Cleaning, for me, was more than sanitation. It was liturgy. I scrubbed in the small, precise way of someone who had an eye for marginalia, how dust gathers in the corner like a note left unread. I pulled down curtains and washed their hems. I recentered photographs, straightened frames, replaced batteries in the smoke detector. The work was physical and meditative. At times, my hands surprised me by moving with the muscle memory of decades at a desk, where one learns to make order out of mess. Each sweep was a small affirmation. This house will be kept as I choose. Then came the planning for the workshop, part practicality, part communal therapy. We booked the community center for a Saturday afternoon at 4, a small table, a sign-in sheet, a pot of coffee. The idea was plain: share the hard, sensible lessons I had relearned, show how paper participates in dignity, explain password hygiene the way you might explain a garden bed. Betty volunteered to bring scones. Zoe offered to make a small handout. Olga said she would teach a short section on how to photograph belongings for inventory. We kept the word legal in the background and practical in the fore because people need to start with something they can do without a lawyer's fee. The room filled with women I knew and some I had only met passing on the stoop. There was a small scatter of men as well, neighbors with a curiosity about keeping things in order. Everyone brought a pen. I had made printed sheets with check boxes: deed, where kept, accounts, who named, passwords, who knows, spare keys, location. We used examples that were anonymized and simple, the way one teaches CPR by first practicing on a dummy. Betty told a story about her sister, who had once let a man manage the bills and found, after a marriage soured, that she had been cut off from the cable account and the online shopping accounts she had used for years. I went to the library and printed copies of what I could, she said. It felt degrading, like showing your underwear to someone, but it was also how I began to build a new life. The room laughed softly, the kind of laugh that held the shape of survival. Olga spoke about passwords as if they were keys in themselves, giving small, concrete tips. Do not write them on a sticky note and leave them in a desk. Use a phrase you can remember and a symbol you do not share. People put their birthdays, she said. Those are public. Use something only the two of you know, like the name of a city you visited together that no one else remembers. The women scribbled, nodded, and compared notes like gardeners swapping seeds. Zoe taught a brief session on how to photograph valuable items and store those pictures in cloud folders with two-step verification. She walked everyone through the steps on her phone with a patience that felt like a mantra: photograph, date, label, upload. We did not give legal advice. We gave the tools that make later advice more effective. Someone asked about wills, and I offered a short, plain explanation of the role a will plays in clarifying intent, a document that, while it does not always prevent disagreement, makes it easier for justice to follow facts. Lena came to the workshop as a guest. She sat in the back and later joined a small group to ask practical questions about separating her accounts and how to build a budget when you are relearning what it means to be an adult, paying rent to a woman who is also your mother. Watching her take notes, balancing the pen between fingers like someone practicing new muscles, gave me a particular kind of satisfaction that was not triumphant, but steady. She had not been disowned by the truth. She had been invited into clarity. After the workshop, the women lingered and shared recipes. Betty swapped the lemon tart recipe with someone who wanted to try it for church, and we made plans to meet again in a month to update our lists and help each other with passwords and practicalities. It felt like building a neighborhood watch not against crime, but against the slow erasure that can happen inside families under the guise of tear. In the evenings after that, I found more time to return to the archive of my life. I walked through the house and let my fingers rest on the spine of books, the edge of frames, the brass of door handles that had weathered like old coins. There was a photograph on the mantel of my husband and me at a small picnic, sunlight like a thin halo over our heads. I sometimes speak to his photograph, not in prayer so much as in conversation. We made a good record, I would tell him. We gave ourselves a line to hold. One afternoon, Lena came to the kitchen with a small envelope and a new determination in her posture. She placed a check on the table the way a person places an instrument of reconciliation. "I'm not ready to be completely alone," she said, "but I can start by paying you something. I want to show I can keep my part." It was a small, pragmatic gesture, and I accepted it without ceremony. We made a simple agreement, a list of utilities she would take over if she chose to, a sliding scale for her rent for a season while she got her finances in order, and an agreement that she would come to the monthly neighborhood group to keep learning. We called it a guest/tenant arrangement on paper because words on paper make expectations legible. Time, which had previously been a tool for Derek's theatrics, became a teacher for Lena. She opened a small savings account with Jenna's help and began to receive alerts on her phone. The first alert made her smile the way a bell makes a small ring of triumph. She started working 2 shifts at the community clinic to increase hours rather than to make up for something lost. It was the beginning of a life that was hers by agency rather than by default. In the quiet months that followed, I set into a steady routine of vigilance and pleasure. I went to church on Sunday mornings sometimes, not because I needed the ritual, but because the church was full of people who had learned to exchange kindness over time. I took a class on watercolor at the community college because painting felt like another way to arrange life into discernible shapes. I made peach cobbler on a Tuesday and invited Betty and Zoe for tea on a Wednesday, as if to stock the present with the small, comforting moments that become an armor no official can file away. One evening, after a day of painting and leaning into slow things, I sat in my green armchair with the volume on the radio turned to the level I loved, not loud, but not apologetic. I thought about silence, not the kind that accepts injustice, but the kind that reserved room for your own decisions. When the television had gone dark that first night, I had chosen a silence that would allow me to see the architecture of what was happening. That silence was not weakness, it was a ledger, a way to mark and count and then act. From time to time, I would get a letter from Roman, a simple card with a neat line or two and the kind of clarity only someone who has watched many doorways can give. "If you need anything," he wrote in one, "call. The work is always better when the paperwork is tidy and the heart is calm." It was the refrain of my life: tidy paper, calm heart. The house settled into a rhythm that suited me. I sat with a kettle, watched the steam make lazy, pale circles, and let the music rise to the volume that pleased me. My life had not been returned to me as though it had been stolen. It had been reclaimed carefully with patience and an account book and the helpful hands of neighbors who loved clean lists. There was no last scene of vindication, no triumphant banner unfurled. Instead, there was the small, satisfying sound of my keys on the side table and the remote on the couch where I could reach it when I wanted to change the channel. Sometimes Lena would knock and ask if she might bake with me. We would set the oven and measure sugar and hold the bowl between us like people negotiating a new treaty. She would ask about bank forms and I would show her how to read a statement without shame. She began to speak with a voice that had the steadiness of someone rebuilding. I could see the lines around her eyes soften as she gained muscle and responsibility. As months turned, I began a small series of neighborhood meetings. Papers and prudent plans, I called them, because the name felt honest and modest. We met on Wednesday afternoons, a time that allowed homemakers and nurses and retired teachers to find a corner of the week for their affairs. We taught one another how to keep a copy of deeds in secure places, how to photograph valuables and put the pictures in a password-protected folder, how to make a list of accounts and designate a trusted contact. We invited Jenna to speak about bank alerts and Betty to give her lemon tart recipe in exchange for guiding a conversation about wills. At one of those meetings, a woman named Marisol spoke up. She had recently moved back to the neighborhood after a divorce and had found that her former spouse had been listed as an authorized signer on a credit card she had believed belonged only to her. "I didn't think to check," she said, her voice flat with the small grief of discovery. "I thought we shared everything. I thought sharing meant trust. I didn't know that trust can be used as an instrument." The room leaned in as if to catch the echo of that sentence. We do not always know which part of trust needs a paper to back it up. We gave practical advice, and we also practiced compassion. The meetings were never a place to shame, but to teach, because the world does not always demand that people know how to guard a life. It is a skill like any other, and one that benefits from repetition and neighbors who will help you practice. I was careful not to turn my story into a sermon. It was a demonstration. This is what clarity looks like. This is how you make decisions without humiliation. Once, late in the winter, when the light had a brittle quality and the peach trees were bare, Lena sat across from me at the kitchen table with a small stack of papers. She had enrolled in a bookkeeping class at the community college. "I want to understand ledgers," she said. "I don't want to be in the dark again." Her handwriting had a new confidence. Note by note, she was learning to annotate her life. I listened and remembered the ledger of love that is not always visible in a marriage or a household. The desire to protect a person can sometimes calcify into a form of possession. You can cover a life in glue and call it care until, if you are not careful, everything that moves gets stuck. This is why signatures matter. This is why legibility matters. And yet, signatures and ledgers alone do not make a family whole. They only make it possible for people to stand with dignity. On a quiet evening, I sat by the window with a small notebook and wrote a letter to myself like a will in miniature. Not about property alone, but about how I wanted to spend my days. More painting, more workshops, afternoon walks with Lena sometimes, and quiet Sundays for reading. I signed it the way I always signed anything that needed to hold, with a hand that had practiced clarity for 35 years at a recorder's desk. The line felt like a promise. The green armchair still held the imprint of many evenings. On one of those evenings, I turned the music a shade higher than usual and let it fill the room, as if announcing that the house was, once again, lived in the way I preferred. The radio hummed, a song I had loved in another life, and I let it be my companion. The kettle sang in time. People still asked about the case. Neighbors thanked me for sharing what I had learned. Lena and I, for all the friction that had started us on this road, baked a peach cobbler for a block party in a summer that felt like celebration more than triumph. Derek, I saw months later across the street, a man reduced to ordinary gait and ordinary days. He did not make a scene. He did not need to. The law had done part of its work. Time had done the rest. Sitting there, music on, kettle quiet, the house warmed by the small domesticities I had chosen for it, I thought of the remote's click that had started the spiral. I thought of the silence I had chosen in that living room, the silence that held a deed until the deed could be presented, the silence that let facts accumulate like ballast until they could be used. Saying nothing had not been surrender, it had been strategy. It was an insistence on order in a world that sometimes prefers the noise of drama to the steady song of procedure. If you have sat in a room that felt foreign and wondered how to make it yours again, know that the work may be slow and that it will ask for both patience and the willingness to let paper carry what words cannot. Ownership is not only about ink, it is about the shape of your days and the people you let into them. It is about the small decisions you make each morning. Who knows the password? Who holds the spare key? Who receives the mail? And the courage to make those decisions plainly. I keep the deed in the leather pouch beneath a stack of crossword puzzles still. It smells faintly of lemon oil and old paper, like the beginning of a quiet sermon. Lena and I have learned to sit across a table and balance a tile of pie between us without letting it speak for truths we now prefer to keep in writing. The women on the block still come by sometimes for tea, and we still trade recipes, and sometimes the conversation centers on passwords, and sometimes on grandchildren, and sometimes on the weather. Life resumes itself in the ordinary way that life returns to a room full of people who respect one another's boundaries. The green armchair is mine by memory and by choice. I sit in it and turn up the music, not to drown out anyone's story, but to make room for mine. It is a simple act, that turn of the dial, but it is also a kind of proclamation. The volume is mine. The keys are where I left them. The deed is where I know it is. Lena calls sometimes to say that she paid a bill on time or that she learned a new password trick. We are not perfect. We are real and trying. If this story reached you and you found something of yourself in it, I invite you to share where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your corner of the world. If you like this, subscribe for more stories, simple, honest accounts of neighbors and papers and the quiet work of reclaiming a life. Tell someone who needs to hear it that it's okay to ask for help and that the papers you keep matter as much as the love you give. Thank you for sitting with me a while.